Hello guys and gals, me Mutahar, and boy oh boy, I have a really bad hangover. Ladies and gentlemen, I did something while I was impaired, and that was hacking an Xbox 360. Now I might be wondering, Muto, why would you ever bother risking soldering while under the influence? Look, I don't know, okay? I'm a boring old man with too much free time these days, so hacking these systems is sort of like my guilty pleasure. Every time I get any system, and if I can hack it, you bet that I will. There are so many hack systems on my desk. Like, for instance, I've got my Vita over here. I've hacked the Vita right now. I've hacked two Vitas. Vitas are great hackable systems. Here's the Mutaphone. Of course, you can imagine this is a hack-together job. There are plenty of devices that I just enjoy modifying. Even if I don't use them, I modify them. Now, the Xbox 360 is one of those devices where I grew up with it. Xbox was my system. You know, for me, when I was a young lad, just getting into online gaming and playing a lot of those classics that I now hold near and dear to me, the Xbox 360 was where it was at. PlayStation 2 before that, and a whole bunch of PlayStation 1 gaming. Now, with the Xbox 360, hacking it is not a simple affair, ladies and gentlemen. So to start off, let's talk about how an Xbox 360 is hacked. For instance, in its initial prime, what people used to do was actually hack the firmware on the DVD drives of the Xbox 360 itself. Now, for a while this worked. People could run pirated games. Unfortunately, Microsoft ended up finding out this exploit, and they started hardware banning every single device. I think the hardware ban was something like they would ban your system to the year 9999. Now, of course, no Xbox 360 will survive that long, and no Xbox 360 is actually going to be unbanned when that year rolls by. Mostly because Xbox Live will also be dead. Now, ladies and gentlemen, after that came the next Xbox hack. Now, some of y'all my age would understand something called JTAG. For those of you who don't know what a JTAG is, a JTAG was basically another hardware hack that was effective up until, like, I think firmware version 7371. Now, as a young kid back then, I wanted a JTAG Xbox 360. Back then, if you had a JTAG Xbox 360, you were the coolest kid on the block. I knew one kid that had it that played Grand Theft Auto 4 earlier, and boy, I had never felt as jealous and sad that day. Now, after that, Xbox 360 started to uncover a new hardware exploit, which is what I did with my Xbox 360. Now, this is called the RGH, which is known as the reset glitch hack. Basically, you are going to solder onto the Xbox motherboard, and effectively, you're going to solder a device that will send small electrical signals, as far as I understand, to the CPU that will allow the Xbox 360 to run unsigned code. Now, I have a few Xbox 360s. This is the one that I use to game officially. I actually use this to play some of my older Xbox 360 games connected to Xbox Live. It's an Xbox Elite system. It's got like 250 gigs of memory on it. I didn't hack this one. I actually used this. Now, I ended up using my original Xbox 360, and boy, I got a story with it. I was lucky, ladies and gentlemen. Now, back in the day, Xbox 360s used to have this thing called the Red Ring of Death, which basically meant that unless you were willing to towel that shit up for 10 minutes and let it run for 30, you had to send it back to Microsoft, okay? Now, I ran through two Xbox 360s. Eventually, Microsoft sent me back a Jasper model. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Jasper model was when they fixed the Red Ring, but of course, like all hardware, eventually that too will die. Now, in this case, modifying the system requires you to identify what motherboard you have, and there are a few of them out there. For instance, this one diagram that I've been looking at pretty much details how to identify which motherboard or system you have. For instance, based on the power plug you had, yes, they looked like this. Very, very, very terrible. These were the newer Xbox 360 Elites or Slims, and these were the older systems. Now, of course, with the combination of the power, cord, and whether they had HDMI or they didn't have HDMI ports, you could identify if you had a Xenon system, which was the original Xbox 360 release, the Jasper one that I had, or the Trinity or Corona that are now the newer Elites and Slim Xbox 360s. New as in, they're pretty retro these days. Now, ladies and gentlemen, after all of this, I had to realize, why did I modify the system? Now, once the inebriation started to wear off and the hangover kicked in, I realized why I hacked the Xbox 360. Because I wanted to play original Xbox games. Now, you might be wondering, but Muda, why couldn't you hack the original Xbox? I have. The problem is trying to connect those older retro systems to a newer OLED TV requires me to hardware modify those systems or use like third-party HDMI dongles, which bring in like input lag and a lot of other issues. Honestly, I just wanted a solution that would work with the least amount of like, cabling and bullshit required. And that's why I looked at the Xbox 360. Because what can you do with an Xbox 360 that's modified? You can run homebrew. You can run Xbox 360 games as well as Xbox 360 games that are region-free. Now, in a lot of cases, there's plenty of good Xbox 360 games that are out there. I'm holding a couple of them in my hands. For instance, Enemy Territory Quake Wars, which actually has its multiplayer component filled with bots on the disc. Isn't that a novel concept, having a multiplayer game be alive after it's dead? Yeah, we're never going to get that again. Games like Tenchu Z, which are also really awesome games. I'm surprised I've met people that have never touched this game. Now, you've also got Vampire Reign, which is known as one of the best stealth action games. Can't.
Come on! It ain't safe here at night!
It's one of the best stealth action games you can probably get your hands on, okay? You've also got games like Fable 2, which is a game me and my brother played up to the ends of the earth, co-op all the way through. And then EB Games screwed up my Godfather purchase by giving me this crappy cover. But yes, the Godfather original for Xbox 360 is an awesome title. Now, of course, beyond this, there are a lot of Japanese Xbox 360 games. Games like Gundam, I think Operation Troy is what they call it, which is an actual decent game. Now, because the Xbox 360 was region locked, basically, if you bought a Japanese game, you couldn't play it on an American Xbox. Now, I don't know who invented region locking. They have to be some level of a sick fuck beyond imagining, because there's no, like, I think this person gets a literal. Now, in a lot of ways, gaming, while having the ability to back up the disk drive to the actual system, which is something you can easily do on these hacked systems, is just a breeze. You never need the disk again, and honestly, I prefer it because I don't want to run my disks into the ground, which is actually a big reason why I hack these systems, just so I can play a lot of my games backed up without ever touching the disks again. Now, beyond running Xbox 360 games that are on a disc, there are plenty of Xbox 360 games that basically were released on the arcade or the Xbox Live Indie section. A lot of games that actually have faced some level of delisting. So if you can find these games somewhere floating around on the internet, running them on a hacked Xbox 360 is a very trivial thing to do. All you have to do is go into your file managers and tap the default.xex. You get how they do, you get how it's exe on PCs, like the executable file. They just like called it xex on the Xbox 360. You get it? Haha, real funny. Basically, you can run a lot of those games right off from your drive and have a good time. They play just like your standard Xbox 360 games. Nothing weird about it. Now, beyond gaming on the Xbox 360 with games that are built for it, what about games that aren't built for it? Well, that's where emulation kicks in, and boy, oh boy, the emulation is always pretty solid on the Xbox 360. There are a lot of games that you can pick from. RetroArch runs underneath it, and if you're not a fan of RetroArch, there are a lot of emulators that you can find floating around on the internet, though all you have to do is copy to the Xbox 360 and run like no tomorrow. Now, in a lot of cases, the experience is about what you can expect from that generation of systems. For instance, Nintendo Entertainment System works about as expected. Super Nintendo works about as expected. You know, I could play games like Chrono Trigger and a lot of those old JRPGs with no problems. Games from the Game Boy Advance series run really good. For instance, I could play Mother 3 on an Xbox 360. That's a pretty poggers moment. Now, beyond all of that, okay, moving on further, running games that are in the PlayStation 1 category were a little bit of an issue. This is where you start to notice the cracks in the matrix, if you will. See, PlayStation 1 performance is about as good as a orgy at a retirement home. I guess it would be funny to watch for 2 seconds until it eventually becomes sad and pathetic. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'll give you a quick example of how it runs.
Definitely broken, sir. 2 play.
Ooh. Now, see, that's Siphon Filter 2, all right? You know, back in the day when I was a kid, I could probably play with that performance, but now that I've developed fucking standards, we are not playing games that way, ladies and gentlemen. But I'm going to actually tie this and bring it back to a later point in this video. Now, beyond that, what the real reason I actually wanted to do all of this was because I wanted to play the original Xbox games, like I told you. Now, to play the original Xbox games was a big deal for me, and I'm gonna actually mention here, Microsoft does a great job with backwards compatibility. If you have an Xbox One or anything from that series, the Xbox One or the Xbox Series, running those classic games is actually very easy to do. You pop the disc in, you download the game package from Xbox servers, and you run them locally on your system. And in a lot of cases, Microsoft has cataloged a lot of those Xbox 360 games. Now, for instance, you could play stuff like Lost Odyssey right off of an Xbox One, and it runs about as well as you'll expect it, just like the original system. Games like Red Dead Redemption, which don't have a PC release, but through Xbox One backwards compatibility, if you have the Xbox One X or the Series X, you can run that game at like 4K. Now, you can also run a lot of original Xbox games as well too. Games like Splinter Cell, Splinter Cell Pandora Tomorrow, and Splinter Cell Chaos Theory. I actually wanted to play Splinter Cell Pandora Tomorrow because for some reason Ubisoft just cannot give Sam Fisher a break. They re-released the game as a trilogy pack on PlayStation 3. I picked it up. It was an absolute pathetic excuse for gaming, so I ended up finding the original Pandora Tomorrow to install onto my good old-fashioned Xbox 360. Later did I realize after playing it on this hacked system that they actually did re-release Pandora Tomorrow on the original Xbox One backwards compatibility. Fucking baffling. My entire reasoning for doing this went out the window. But hey, let me just get back to it. Basically on the internet, you can find the original Xbox 360 backwards compatibility files. So to understand, Xbox 360 used emulation to actually emulate the original Xbox system. So what would happen is, let's say you wanted to run a game like Halo 2. You would put the Halo 2 disc into the Xbox 360. Microsoft would check the Halo 2 and check in its servers that, do we have a emulator for it? They would let you download a tiny emulator file. You would store that on your system, and you would use the emulator to emulate Halo 2. Because the Xbox 360 utilized a different architecture, you would have to emulate the original Xbox architecture to play those games. So yeah, Microsoft is kind of on the cutting edge of emulating all of their systems for back compatibility. And honestly, Sony and Nintendo could learn a whole fucking lot from them. But that's a different video. So to understand, I was able to download these packages, copy them over to the Xbox 360 drive using the actual freestyle dashboard, that's the hack dashboard. And if you've noticed, I'm actually using the original Blade style dashboard that was in the very original Xbox 360 release. Some of you people will remember that. Microsoft changed it for the worse years down the road. But basically by doing this, you can copy any ISO file for the original Xbox, and it should in theory just run. And I've got some examples. For instance, Pandora Tomorrow works about as well as you can expect it. There are some frame rate issues, and I'm going to chalk it up to the fact that this is, of course, an emulation. But for the most part, it runs fine, and I can absolutely play it. Grand Theft Auto Vice City ran really well, and the reason I would play it on this is, again, they have not removed Billie Jean from this system. So you can play the original Vice City in all its glory, and then some. You can actually play games like 50 Cent Bulletproof. And this is where more cracks in the Matrix show. See, because this is emulation, it's not perfect. So this is where you'll start to notice like graphical errors and bugs. But because we're on a hacked system, we don't need Microsoft's whitelist to tell us what we can play or what we don't need to play. We can basically run any Xbox ISO file. And in my testing, most of them worked relatively well. Some of them have frame rate issues in some key sections, some of them have graphical problems. But I would say in my testing, most big titles worked out of the box. Now, ladies and gentlemen, at the end of all this, was any of this fucking worth it? The answer to that is, I guess if you're a tinkerer, maybe. Ladies and gentlemen, hacking these older systems is kind of losing a lot of its appeal. Because in a lot of ways, emulating the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 on a PC nowadays is slowly becoming a bigger reality. So in a way, I would say 5-6 years down the road, Xbox 360 and PS3 will be pretty well preserved. We're actually able to play some Xbox 360 games using the Xenia emulator on PC. And in a lot of cases it works. There are a lot of games that don't work, but the Xenia team is doing a really good job. I think they were able to get Red Dead Redemption running at 60 frames per second on the PC. Kind of fucking baller move. Now, even as far as emulators go, this system is just not strong enough to really be worth emulating. Honestly, I would recommend you pick up an Xbox Series S, or if you can afford it, an Xbox Series X, and using Microsoft's like $20 developer mode, just use that, modify your new system, and run emulators that way. I made a video on Xbox Series X emulation, and PS2 works on it, PS1 works on it, fuck, any modern system works relatively well on an Xbox Series X or Series S. The CPU updates alone on those systems are just miles above what this system is ever able to provide. Honestly, if you did want something from this generation, I'd recommend you get a PlayStation 3. I've made a video talking about PS3 modifications, and since I've made that video like 4 years ago, modifying a PlayStation 3 is infinitely easier than modifying an Xbox 360, and you get a fuck ton more value out of it. For instance, PlayStation 3s allow you to have access to PS3 games, which there are a lot of classics there, a variety of PS2 games through emulation, which is very easily achieved on almost any PlayStation 3 out there. PlayStation 1 emulation, which as far as I've been able to test, is pretty much 100% compatible with everything, even down to using discs. And then, using emulators that are also available on the PS3 scene, I'm able to play a lot of those classic games just fine on a PS3. In fact, I'd even recommend getting a PlayStation 4. Those are actually modifiable pretty heavily nowadays. So yeah, ladies and gentlemen, if you were to modify any of these systems, the Xbox 360 is nice and all, but as far as modifying it goes, just get yourselves the PlayStation 3 or get yourselves a Vita. I think it's a far more enjoyable affair. But you know what? This was an interesting test. I hacked an Xbox 360. I had one use case, playing original Xbox games. And the one game that I really wanted to play was already on Xbox One anyways. But that said, though, if you're into the Xbox 360, because there are some pretty good games, like Vampire Reign, and if you just want to do it for the sake of hacking the system, go for it, ladies and gentlemen. Now, there is one question that I'm sure people are asking me. Can you run hacks on Xbox Live through it? Yes, you can. But because RGH is a pretty known exploit, I'm pretty sure your ban is probably going to happen in like 5 seconds anyways. So unless you got a fuck ton of Xbox 360 key vaults to burn out, then sure, it might be an endeavor, it might be a fun affair. But you're not going to get far with hacking systems online. So, and if you're going to do that, I definitely don't endorse it. But as far as preserving Xbox 360 games and, playing region-free stuff, absolutely worth it. Banger hack. And if you want to run emulators on it, well, Super Nintendo runs great, and Mother 3 is totally playable on an Xbox 360. So ladies and gentlemen, if you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Dislike it if you dislike it. I am